All right, so 13.2, I should be able to cover this all in one screencast, so that'll be good. So we've talked about how Treaty of Greenville happened, and then later on we had the War of 1812, which, the British were again stirring up Native Americans in the Northwest Territory. But eventually what happened was, with the end of the War of 1812 and the death of Tecumseh, resistance in the Northwest area, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, those areas, Native American resistance was pretty much put down in that area. And so that was pretty much safe. And those Native American groups either moved to Canada, moved out of that area, honestly down to Texas to cause problems in Texas later on. But there were some groups that were still Native American tribes that were living in the Deep South that were still in place. And one of those groups we had talked about were the Creeks, and Andrew Jackson had sort of subdued them with the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. But there were still other groups that were living in the Deep South. And you can see my little poster down there in the bottom. They include the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creeks, Chickasaw, and Seminole. And we're going to talk about those people. All right, and I've got them listed up here at the top. Now, a lot of these groups lived down in Florida and Georgia, and some of these groups had created successful farming communities, and some had adopted to white customs and even owned slaves. And these people were mostly the Cherokee, and they become pretty successful. And it was obvious that the Native Americans were here first, and that some of these people were not adversarial. They were not the Creeks. They had not been putting heads on poles around in the countryside. But the white people wanted their land. It's just that simple. The white people wanted their land, especially once cotton became a huge cash crop across the South and plantations and slavery began spreading. It wasn't just about trying to coexist with the Native Americans across the South. It was about taking their land. And oddly enough, small deposits of gold had been found at the foothills of the Appalachians in Georgia. And they thought there was more gold there, and so they wanted the Cherokee off that land. So they asked the federal government to relocate these Native Americans west of the Mississippi River, thinking that this is a good idea. And Jackson supported this idea while he was president. And he had fought the Native Americans across the South, like I told you, for a lot of different reasons. And he honestly, truly, and like I said, I know a lot about Jackson, he truly believed that it would be better for everybody concerned if these people could be relocated to the Great Plains, because he believed that, and in some instances he was probably right, he believed that there was not going to be coexistence, that the cultures were too different, that the Native Americans were never going to really be able to assimilate into white culture, and that the white people were never really going to accept Native Americans. Now, keep in mind, he had adopted 2 Native American children and raised them as his sons. So he wasn't completely, I know everybody likes to paint him as someone who just wants to kill all the Native Americans, but I think he saw this as just a complete clash of cultures. Now, I'm not trying to paint him as Mr. Nice Guy. He wants them off the southern area for the same reason as the rest of the white people do. He wants to take their land. All right, so this is where we're going to come up with the Worcester versus Georgia court decision here in a minute, which was important. So the Indian Removal Act that they wrote up in Congress allowed the federal government to pay Native Americans to move west. So we're going to pay them. We're not going to just move them or pay them. And Jackson sent some officials down to sign treaties with the tribes in the southeast. And Congress established Indian Territory in what we now know is Oklahoma. That was, quote, Indian Territory. And so we were going to pay these people and move them to Oklahoma. They're going to be free to do whatever they want there, and we're going to be able to everybody's going to be able to do their own thing. Of course, most of these groups felt forced to sell their land because that's mostly what happened. They were forced to sell their land. If they chose not to, that was too bad for them. They were going to have to sell it. And way back in the 1790s, so that's way back at this point, that's 30, 40, 50 years ago, the federal government had recognized the Cherokee as a separate nation. It was in writing. And they're fairly civilized. Their leader, Sequoyah, you might want to remember his name. That's who we named the trees after. The giant redwood trees are called sequoias after him. He wants his people to go to school. They open schools. He writes down an alphabet for the Cherokee language. They write up their own constitution. They're trying to adapt to the white culture. They're the ones who own slaves. They're the ones who are really an awful lot like the white people that live all around them. But the state of Georgia, where the Cherokee live, refused to accept this nation status of a group. And again, I would remind you, I don't think it says this in your book, but again, I know a little bit about this. They had found small deposits of gold in the foothills of the Appalachians there at the southern end of them in Georgia. And of course, they don't realize that there's not much gold at all. It's just a little tiny bit. And, it's like dollar signs flashed in their eyes. And they're like, okay, maybe there's more gold. We've got to get these people off the land. So they don't have the gold. We want the gold. And plus, the spread of farming and plantations across the South was happening at the same time. So the Cherokee are refusing to accept the money. They're refusing to move. They don't want to do this thing. And in 1830, Georgia, the state, made the Cherokee part of the state, and it forces the laws on the people. They're like, okay, you have to do this. You can't be a separate nation. Well, the Cherokee appeals to the Supreme Court. This is where you get Worcester versus Georgia. 1832, Worcester versus Georgia. Chief Justice John Marshall, he's still there, and he rules that Georgia has no right to interfere with the Cherokee. In other words, he is asserting the national government's right to decide here. Georgia, you can't decide what goes on with the Native Americans. It's only the national government's job to make this decision. Okay, that's really happening here. Jackson's not interested in this at all. He doesn't care what John Marshall said. He literally, this is a quote on him. John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Because he was going to have the Cherokee moved one way or the other. And no one, not the Congress or the people of the country or the Supreme Court itself, was willing or able to stop Jackson's removal of the Cherokee. It was just that simple. Because the fact was that most of the people in the country agreed with him. And so when you had everybody agreeing with him, even though he was going against the Supreme Court, there wasn't a whole lot to be done about it. And this is how you got the Trail of Tears. About 500 Cherokee did go ahead and sign the Treaty of New Eshota, and you're going to have to know that treaty, the Treaty of New Eshota. And they agreed to give up all their land in 3 years' time. So they're going to say, give us 3 years to get our stuff together and move out of here. And the Cherokee chief sent a protest to the Senate explaining that, well, wait a minute, some of the Cherokee signed this, but it doesn't represent all of us. There's 17,000 of us, and only 500 people signed. And maybe even some influential white people, Webster and Clay, they opposed the treaty as being unfair because and remember, Clay is not exactly an Indian lover either, because he was one of the war hawks that was, so upset because of the way the Native Americans were raiding on whites in Kentucky and Ohio. But they see this as being unfair because it's 500 people, but it's 17,000 people. But, nothing's going to stop it at this point. But so in 1736, the Senate approves the treaty anyway, and the Cherokee are supposed to be moved off by 1838, but only about 2,000 of them moved voluntarily. Remember, there's 17,000 Cherokee. By this point in time, Jackson is out of office, but the person who was in office next after him, Martin Van Buren, orders the army to forcibly remove the rest of them. And remember this guy's name, Winfield Scott. So by May 1838, Winfield Scott and 7,000 soldiers begin to forcibly remove the Cherokee from their land. Understand that not all of them left. Some of them run up into the Appalachian Mountains, up into the valleys and up into the forests and whatnot, and they hide and they stay there. So between June and November, soldiers rounded up as many Cherokee as they could find, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, and they force a march west. Again, I've got a picture down here at the bottom. Does this make any sense? Between June and November, on the Great Plains, they're forcing a march west. It makes no sense whatsoever. It would have been horrible in any situation, but when they had them rounded up and crowded into camps, a lot of them got sick from disease from drinking bad water because, of course, the soldiers really don't care about the quality of life. So a lot of them died. About 2,000 of them died before they ever moved them. And more died on the march west. So about by the time they got there to where they were supposed to be, about a fourth of them were dead, and thus we call it the Trail of Tears.